They didn't know that the man they called a dead end would spend the next 22 years proving them wrong about everything. The last time my father looked at me with any warmth in his eyes, I was 17 and had just been accepted to the University of Toronto's pre-law program. He framed my acceptance letter, put it on the wall in his study, right beside his own law degree from Osgoode Hall. He used to bring his colleagues over and point to it. "That's my daughter," he'd say. "She's going to carry the family name the right way." My father, Gordon Ashford, was a senior partner at one of Bay Street's oldest litigation firms. My mother was a family court judge in Ontario. I was raised in a house in Forest Hill where the carpets were the kind you couldn't run on, and the dinner conversations were always about precedent, about legacy, about what our family represented in this city. I don't say this to sound ungrateful. I'm saying it so you understand what it meant when they eventually looked at me and decided I was no longer worth that framed letter on the wall. I met Kyle in my second year at U of T, not in a lecture hall, not at some faculty mixer. I met him at a hardware store near Bloor West Village on a Saturday morning when I was trying to figure out why my apartment radiator had stopped working, and I had absolutely no idea what I was looking at. He was there buying supplies. He took one look at what I pulled up on my phone, laughed, not unkindly, and told me I was about to make it significantly worse. He drove to my building that afternoon and fixed it in 40 minutes. He was a licensed welder who ran his own small fabrication shop out of Etobicoke. He was 24, soft-spoken, and the first person I'd met in years who didn't seem to be performing anything. We dated for 8 months before I told my parents. I want to be honest, I knew. I knew before I said his name at dinner what was going to happen. I'd been mentally rehearsing it for weeks, picking at the edges of it, trying to find the version where it went fine. There was no such version. My mother set down her fork. My father asked me to repeat myself. I said his name again. Kyle Brennan. Welder. Etobicoke. I watched my father's face go through several things in about 4 seconds, and none of them were good. He said Kyle sounded like a trade school dropout with ambitions that stopped at a Tim Hortons on the way to work. My mother didn't defend me. She said she was sure he was a nice young man, but that I needed to think about what I was doing with my future, about the kind of person who fit into the life I was supposed to build. That phrase, supposed to build. As if my life had already been constructed by someone else, and I was just moving into it. I told them I wasn't going to stop seeing him. My father said, "Then you can stop seeing us." I don't think he expected me to stand up, pick up my bag, and walk out. But I did. I drove back to my apartment and sat on the floor of my kitchen for a long time. Kyle called around 10 that night. He could tell by my voice that something had happened. I told him everything. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I'm sorry. That's my fault, and I'm sorry. Not they're wrong or forget them. Just, I'm sorry that you're hurting." That's the thing about him. He always knew which part of a situation actually mattered. My parents sent one email 2 weeks later. It was 3 lines. They said they loved me, that their door remained open if I came to my senses, and that they expected me to make the right decision before my 3rd year started. I never replied. I finished my law degree. I articled at a mid-sized firm in downtown Toronto that did mostly employment and tenant rights work, which was about as far from Bay Street as you could get while still wearing a suit. Kyle's fabrication shop had grown by then. He picked up contracts with a couple of commercial construction companies and hired 2 other welders. We got an apartment together in Roncesvalles. We were happy. The kind of happy that doesn't make noise but is very steady underneath everything. We got married in the summer, 4 years after that dinner. The ceremony was at a small venue near the Distillery District. His whole family came. His parents drove down from Sudbury. His sister flew in from Vancouver. From my side, there was no one. I had a law school friend as my maid of honor and 2 colleagues at the table where my family was supposed to sit. My father did not come. My mother did not come. My grandmother sent a card that arrived 2 days after the wedding, which I've always suspected was my aunt's doing, not hers. I stood at the end of that aisle, and I did not cry. I'd already done that grieving, privately, over months. By that day, I had made a kind of peace with the gap where they should have been. Kyle saw my face as I walked toward him, and he gave me this look. Just steady, just I see you, I'm here. And I thought, okay, this is enough. This is actually enough. We had our daughter 3 years later. We named her June. She had Kyle's coloring and, according to his mother, my exact stubborn expression, raising her in that Roncesvalles apartment. Then in the small house we bought in Swansea when she was 2 was the most ordinary and most satisfying thing I have ever done. June started school. Kyle's business kept growing. I moved into a small family law practice with 2 partners, and we took a lot of legal aid cases because we wanted to, because there was work that mattered to do. My parents existed somewhere at the edge of my life, the way a scar exists. You stop noticing it until something catches the light wrong. June was 16 when things changed. Not with my parents, with me first, because I need to tell you what I'd built before I tell you about the knock at the door, or none of it makes sense. By the time June was in high school, I had been practicing family law for 11 years. I knew the inside of Ontario court more than I'd ever expected to. I had represented people going through some of the worst weeks of their lives, and I hope I'd done it with some actual care. Kyle had grown his fabrication shop into a legitimate mid-size operation. 8 employees, 2 long-term commercial contracts, a reputation that meant he had a waiting list. We had paid off the house in Swansea. June was taking AP classes and doing robotics, of all things. She was the kind of teenager who fixed things rather than breaking them, which I suspected came from watching her father all her life. We were fine, better than fine, honestly. We were genuinely good. The call came on a Thursday evening in March. I didn't recognize the number. It was a 416 area code, but not one of my clients. I almost let it go to voicemail. I picked up on the last ring. It was my mother. Her voice was different, smaller. She apologized immediately, not for anything specific, just, "I'm sorry to call like this. I'm sorry to call without warning." She said she'd gotten my number from my aunt. She said she needed to talk to me. She said my father had been diagnosed with early-onset vascular dementia 8 months ago, and that it had progressed faster than anyone expected. She said she was struggling. She said the word struggling, like it cost her something. I stood in my kitchen, the same kind of standing still I'd done in another kitchen 16 years ago, and I didn't say anything for a long moment. Then I asked if she was calling because she needed something specific or because she was calling to reconnect. She said both. She said she knew she didn't have the right to ask for either. I told her I needed some time. She said of course. She said thank you for picking up. I sat with it for 3 days. I talked to Kyle, who listened without steering. He said, "Whatever you decide, it's the right decision, because it'll be yours." June overheard part of it one evening and asked me what was going on. She was 16 and perceptive, and she didn't like that I'd been quiet. I gave her the short version. She thought about it for a minute, the way she did when she was processing something, and then she said, "Are you going to see them?" I said I didn't know. She said, "I think you should at least see what they actually want before you decide. You can't decide properly from a distance." She was 16. I don't know where she gets it. I called my mother back on Sunday. We met at a coffee shop in Leaside. Neutral ground. Her suggestion, which I thought showed some self-awareness, she looked older. Not badly, just genuinely older, and tired in the specific way that caregiving makes you tired. My father was in a memory care facility in North York. She was still living in Forest Hill, still technically a judge, though she'd reduced her caseload. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and looked at me like someone who had been rehearsing a conversation for a very long time and was now terrified to start it. She apologized. Not in 3 lines this time. She talked for almost 20 minutes about the dinner where everything broke, about the years after, about the things she told herself to make the silence easier to live with. She said she told herself I'd come back when I was ready. And then years passed, and then more years, and she'd looked up one day and realized what she'd done. She said she'd been wrong about Kyle. She said she'd been wrong about what mattered. She said the word wrong plainly, without softening it, which I hadn't expected. I didn't perform forgiveness. I wasn't ready for that, and I told her so. I said I believed she meant what she was saying and that I needed time to figure out what I wanted this to look like, if it looked like anything at all. She nodded. She said, "There's something else I need to tell you, about why I've been thinking about this now, beyond your father." I waiting. She told me that my father, before the dementia had progressed significantly, had contacted a former client, not a legal matter, a personal one. It turned out that my father, the man who told me that Kyle Brennan would embarrass our family name, had a son he'd never acknowledged, a relationship before he married my mother, a woman he'd paid to stay quiet, A son who had grown up in Winnipeg knowing exactly who his biological father was and being given exactly nothing by him. Not financially, not emotionally, not in any other way. The son's name was Adam. He was 31. He had sent my father a letter 2 years earlier. My father, in one of his clearer months, had apparently written back, and then the dementia had taken most of the thread. I sat with that for a long time. My mother had found out 6 months ago when she was sorting through my father's correspondence trying to organize his affairs. She said she cried for 3 days. Not because of the affair. That was 25 years ago, and she'd apparently had her own suspicions she'd never voiced, but because of what her husband had done to a child. She said she'd tracked down Adam's contact information. She'd written to him. He'd written back. She said he was a kind person. She said that with some sadness. I thought about Kyle, fixing my radiator on a Saturday afternoon and never asking for anything except honesty. I thought about what my father had said to me. You're throwing away the family name, while he was quietly paying someone to make a different kind of shame disappear. The hypocrisy of it settled in my chest like something very cold and very heavy. I asked my mother what she was hoping would happen. With Adam, with me, with any of it. She said she didn't know. She said she thought maybe we all deserved to know each other if we wanted to. She said she wasn't going to push. She said she'd already done enough pushing in the wrong directions to last a lifetime, and that whatever happened now had to be the choice of the people involved. I drove home slowly. June was at robotics practice. Kyle was in the backyard doing something with the fence gate. I sat on the back steps and watched him work, the way he moved, focused, unhurried, confident in what his hands were doing, and I thought about the years, 22 of them. I thought about what my father had thrown away, and not just me. Kyle noticed me after a few minutes. He set down his tools and came and sat beside me. I told him everything. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "That poor kid in Winnipeg." That was the moment I started crying. Not for myself. For the fact that my husband's first thought, after hearing all of that, was for the 31-year-old man who'd grown up without a father who wanted him. That's who Kyle Brennan is. That's who my parents told me would embarrass our family name. I reached out to Adam by email 3 weeks later. I wrote it very carefully, not wanting to overwhelm him or obligate him to anything. I said I was his half-sister, that I'd only recently learned about him, that I had no expectations, but that I wanted him to know the door was open if he ever wanted to talk. He replied within a day. He said he'd known about me for years. He'd looked me up once, seen that I was a lawyer in Toronto. He said he'd wondered sometimes if I knew about him. He said he didn't have any anger toward me. He said that was his actual feeling, not something he was performing. We video called the following Sunday. June sat with me because I'd told her and she'd asked if she could be there. Kyle made himself scarce, but I saw him pass the doorway twice. Adam had his father's jaw. He had his father's way of tilting his head when he was thinking. Beyond that, he was nothing like what I'd been raised to be. He worked as a social worker in Winnipeg. He'd spent 12 years working with Peg. He'd spent 12 years working with kids in care. He was soft-spoken in the same way Kyle was soft-spoken, competently, not apologetically. We talked for 2 hours. At one point, June said to him, very simply, "I think it's good that you exist." He laughed, genuinely, and said, "Thank you," and I saw something in his face relax that I didn't think had been relaxed for a long time. My mother met Adam in person in May. I wasn't there for that. I thought they needed that without me in the middle. She told me afterward it had been one of the hardest and most important conversations of her life. She said she'd apologized until she ran out of words, and he'd told her that he appreciated it, and that he'd needed to hear it, and that he didn't want to decide anything in a rush about what their relationship would be going forward. She said he was very fair about it. My mother asked, toward the end of that same call with me, if June could ever meet him. I said that was June's decision. She was old enough to make it. June said yes. They met on a Saturday afternoon in June, the month, not my daughter. Though she was there too, which I enjoyed, at a park near the Humber River. Adam brought his partner, a quiet woman who worked in occupational therapy. Kyle brought coffee for everyone. I sat on a bench and watched my daughter talk animatedly to a man she'd only met twice before on a screen, and watched Kyle shake Adam's hand with the kind of ease that Kyle has with everyone, and watched my mother sitting slightly apart, not intruding, giving the moment its space. I thought about Forest Hill, about the carpets you couldn't run on. I thought about a hardware store near Bloor West Village. My relationship with my mother is not repaired. I want to be honest about that. We are building something new, slowly, and it does not have the same shape as what broke. She calls on Sundays now. She asks about June and about Kyle's shop and about the cases I can tell her about, the ones where something good happened for someone who needed it. She talks about my father, his better days and his harder ones, without asking me to feel something specific about any of it. I appreciate that. Adam and I have become, carefully and genuinely, something like family. He came to Toronto in September with his partner. We had dinner at the house in Swansea. Kyle made pasta, which he'd been perfecting for years. June showed Adam her robotics project, which he listened to with complete attention. At one point, the two of them were in the kitchen talking about something, and I stood in the doorway and thought, this person grew up not knowing he had a sister who would have liked knowing him. And then I thought, he knows now. There's no neat ending to this. My father is in a memory care facility, and some days he knows my mother and some days he doesn't. I visited once, in October. He looked at me for a while, not sure. Then something seemed to settle in him and he said my name. Just my name. Nothing else. I sat with him for an hour. I didn't need him to apologize. I don't know if that's growth or just the particular peace that comes from having built a life that doesn't require anything from him anymore. Kyle picked me up from that visit. He didn't ask how it went until I'd been in the car long enough to be ready to answer. When I told him, he just reached over and took my hand on the center console, and we drove home like that, through the October streets, past the city my parents had told me I needed to inherit correctly. I inherited something, just not what they planned. June starts university applications next year. She wants to study engineering. When I told my mother, she said, "That's wonderful, she'll be brilliant." And then she paused and said, "She gets it from Kyle, doesn't she?" Not a question, just a thing she was finally able to say out loud. I said, "Yeah, she really does." I keep coming back to that image of my father pointing at my acceptance letter on his study wall. So proud. So certain he knew exactly what kind of life I was supposed to walk into. The thing is, he wasn't wrong to want good things for me. I understand that now, in a way I couldn't at 22. What he was wrong about, profoundly, consequentially wrong about, was believing that his judgment of what was good carried more weight than my own lived experience of what was real. He looked at Kyle and saw a ceiling. I looked at Kyle and saw someone who showed up. Those are not the same thing, and no amount of prestige or precedent changes that. What I've come to understand, slowly, over years of doing family law and watching people at their most fractured, is that the choices that define us aren't usually the dramatic ones. They're the quiet ones, the ones where nobody's watching. Kyle fixed my radiator and didn't ask for anything. He sat beside me the night my parents ended contact, and his first instinct was to apologize for causing me pain. Not to defend himself. Not to argue his worth. That's not nothing. That's actually everything, and it takes a particular kind of character to move through the world that way. Unrecognized, undeterred. My parents mistook the absence of credentials for the absence of integrity. That's the mistake I think about most. June is going to be an engineer. She grew up watching her father solve problems with his hands and her mother argue for people who couldn't afford to be ignored, and somewhere in that she found her own direction. That didn't happen because we pushed her toward it. It happened because she grew up in a house where the adults around her did work they actually believed in, and she absorbed that it was possible to build a life on your own terms. That's the only inheritance worth passing down. The demonstration that it can be done. Adam grew up without that. He grew up knowing exactly who his father was and receiving nothing from him anyway. Not acknowledgement, not curiosity, not a single phone call. My father, who told me that my choices would embarrass the family name, was quietly paying to keep his own son invisible. I've sat with that a long time. The weight of it. What it means to hold yourself to a standard you perform publicly but abandon privately, and what that kind of fracture does to everyone downstream. There's a line I keep tracing. The choices we make when we think no one is paying attention are the ones that most accurately describe who we are. My father didn't know that June would grow up to find Adam interesting and worth knowing. He didn't know that the son he erased would turn out to be a social worker in Winnipeg who spent his career showing up for kids who'd been left behind. He didn't know that the welder he dismissed would raise a daughter who leads with curiosity and builds things that work. But those outcomes weren't random. They followed from the decisions people made, day after day, in the absence of an audience. That's what I want June to carry with her, not the drama of what happened, not the estrangement or the reconciliation or the complicated grief of a father who can no longer apologize clearly. Just this, that good judgment, honest effort, and the willingness to be decent when it costs you something. Those things compound over time, exactly the way damage does. You don't get to choose what you inherit, but you get to choose every day what you pass forward. Kyle is still fixing things. June is still building them. And I'm still, after all of it, grateful I picked up the phone in a hardware store aisle and admitted I had no idea what I was doing.